Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon or good evening to those of you who are not on the East Coast of the United States. My name is Benjamin Hopkins, and I am the director of the Seeger Center for Asian Studies. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all today to this book launch by Professor Robert Sutter, my colleague. As many of you no doubt are familiar with Professor Sutter's work, it's a great pleasure to be able to give him this opportunity to talk about his new work, Chinese Foreign Relations, which I think we can all agree is an extremely timely and changeable topic that is going to receive not only continuing attentions now, but as we exit the pandemic and re-enter some sort of normal, hopefully in the coming months, will nonetheless be an important focus of the Biden administration as well. Before I introduce our speaker and today's event, just a couple of ground rules and reminders to everyone. This session is being recorded, and we hope to be able to post it to our website perhaps next week once we get all the audio sorted and everything. There is, of course, an opportunity for everyone to please ask any questions you may have of Professor Sutter. You will find a Q&A panel on the right-hand side of your WebEx window. If you can please put your questions there, and if you can also identify yourself during the Q&A session, which I will be moderating, I'll pick questions out of there and present them to Dr. Sutter. So, of course, as in real life and in person, these are always much more rewarding intellectual exchanges when they are precisely that, exchanges. So I really encourage you to put your questions, comments, and observations there. And I'd also encourage you to do so throughout. Please don't hesitate and wait until the end of Professor Sutter's presentation. If you have questions that come up during it, please go ahead and put them there. With that said, it's my privilege to introduce Professor Sutter, who is a professor of practice of international affairs at the Elliott School and has been a colleague of mine for almost 10 years. Before he joined us at the Elliott School, Professor Sutter had a long, illustrious, and distinguished career in government, mainly in the intelligence sector, serving across a variety of institutions, including the Congressional Research Service, the Department of State, and the National Intelligence Council. He's the author of a number of works, including the one we're going to be talking about today, and is indeed perhaps one of the most noted and notable commentators on American-Chinese relations, and has had quite an active profile regarding those over the past couple of years, as we've seen a significant change in those. Today, Professor Sutter will be talking about his new book, just published by Ronan Littlefield, Chinese Foreign Relations, Power and Policy of an Emerging Global Force. I'd also encourage all of you, this is a fantastic work and conveniently fits into stockings of any size. So we will have a stocking stuffer offer with a 25% discount code that I will share at the end. But with that, I think I've talked enough, and it's my great privilege to turn it over to Dr. Sutter. Over to you, Bob.
Thank you very much, Ben, for this very nice introduction. It's a pleasure for me to be here with you all and to share some views about my book. But it's more the lessons that I've learned from doing the book, which I really want to share. And that leads to the title of the event today. Does Chinese foreign behavior warrant sustained U.S. countermeasures? And when I did this study, it gave me a sense of the answer to that question. And so my purpose today is to have a little introduction, just explain why I write these books and so forth, and this one in particular. And then this book is in its 5th edition. And this edition is a major overhaul because of what's been happening and what I've learned. And so I wanted to contrast this edition with the beginning editions and what's changed in Chinese foreign behavior. And then I want to go into the question that is the center of this event. Does Chinese foreign behavior warrant sustained U.S. countermeasures? And that will be the main thing I'll discuss today. And then we'll have a brief outlook section looking at the United States and what it's likely to do, given these challenges that China poses. So I look forward to the question and answer period. So just a brief introduction. I'm an old person. I've been at this business for over 50 years, looking at China. And what I've found is that I'm very much an evidence-based analyst. I rely on evidence. Of course, I teach, and I'm an academic, and I look at theory, and I look at policy, and I've worked in policy arenas in various ways, and I look at theory and policy-driven analysis, and I don't find it as satisfactory as evidence-based analysis. Now, the downside with evidence-based analysis is that it's a little boring. You have to gather all this evidence, and it makes it a little pedantic sometimes. But the bottom line here is that it's more reliable. And so what I'm offering today is something that I think is reliable. It's something that's based on facts and evidence and can be understood that way. And it's different than the previous editions of this book. As I said, this fifth edition is a major overhaul. It was very hard to do. And so what's changed from when it first came out, maybe 13 years ago, the first edition of this book was published. And what's happened is that so many things have been overtaken by events. And maybe this will help you to understand what's changed with China's behavior to some degree or another. So we used to have this question, will China continue a moderate, accommodating approach in foreign affairs? That was a fundamental question in previous editions. That's no longer a question. We're not that interested in that sort of thing. Number two, does China have a long-lasting strategy of moderation and accommodation in foreign affairs? That was premised in 13 years ago. That was a very strong school of thought. And that idea that China is moving in that direction is obsolete at this point. Does China have a long-lasting strategy in foreign affairs? Here you still have debate. In the past, the debate was between those that said China had a strong drive to be accommodating to the world, and those that said, no, China has hidden objectives and wants to dominate Asia, wants to dominate the world. And those like me who said, I'm not sure if China has a strategy at all, because the record is full of changes all the time. Well, the people that argued for moderation, I think, are very much on the defensive. Whereas those who argue that the Chinese have this plan that they're going to implement are very salient. But there's still room for people like me who says, I'm not convinced that they have a coherent strategy, a game plan that they're following at all. I think it moves according to circumstances. Circumstances have a bigger impact on Chinese behavior. And then there are these other changes that have taken place over the past 13 years that are now all overtaken by events. Number one, China accommodates and increasingly conforms to world governance and norms influenced by the United States and Western countries. That was very common 13 years ago. That's not the case today, obviously. Number two, China's foreign policy is heavily subordinate to domestic policy. It wants stability, and therefore it's going to be very moderate in dealing with foreign affairs. That also has been overtaken by events. China is defensive and reactive to world circumstances heavily influenced by the United States and Western countries. That, too, is much less than it was in the past. And then a fourth one, China is unprepared to make big economic commitments abroad. Well, that's not true anymore. Number five, China's involvement in areas beyond its periphery, that is in Africa, Middle East, Europe, Latin America, is not directed at challenging Western U.S. interest. That is no longer the case. And number six, China supports European unity, and it supports ASEAN-led regionalism. And both of these have big exceptions today. So that's what we've learned. That shows how things have changed in a very broad way. And since 2018, an upsurge we've had and we've benefited from, and I've benefited greatly from, an upsurge in wide-ranging, in-depth studies of the heretofore hidden, disguised, denied, or unappreciated elements of Chinese foreign behavior. which are at odds with China's avowed intentions. In the past, people like me would look at China's avowed intentions and we'd take this very seriously. We thought these things really were important. These studies have shown that Chinese statements really aren't to be taken seriously in the way I did in the past. They should be taken seriously. This is what they want you to think about, they being the leaders of China. But the behavior is very different. And so what this means is that China's what it means is that we are now, these challenges are continuing against the U.S. and its allies and partners, and China is publicly mendacious about this. They say things like, we will not interfere in a country's internal affairs. Well, this is just totally wrong as far as their behavior is concerned. Or we don't seek hegemony. Well, that's not correct either in so many cases. And China believes in the international globalization. Well, it does when it works for China. And so these kinds of things is what we've seen in the practice of China in studying the practice, and these studies have amplified that very well. So now let's look at the debate in the United States over what we do about China and the relevance of this book to that debate. China was the main foreign policy issue in the 2020 campaign. And it has a continuing strong debate going forward. You can cut it in different ways. The way I see it is that advocates for hard countermeasures toward China, these are people in the Congress, people in the administration, in the current government, not the incoming government, they say the previous U.S. administration's failure to counter Chinese challenges resulted in China now posing an enormous danger to American interests. The opponents of that view, the critics of that, say they play down the past failures and dangers posed by China, and they condemn the excesses of the recent hard line toward China by the U.S. administration and the Congress. And they favor a more moderate and nuanced approach. Now, there are degrees here, but the point is, does China's behavior warrant a continued effort countermeasures on the part of the United States that's strong and vigorous? So which approach is correct? And my view is that my assessment, looking at the evidence, finds the United States, its allies and partners are fundamentally challenged by a wide-ranging and intensifying Chinese efforts to weaken America in headlong pursuit of ever-expanding Chinese ambitions. If successful, the Chinese efforts will undermine and overshadow the existing world order, with one dominated by an authoritarian party state focused on advancing Chinese wealth and power at the expense of others. This is not a pretty picture. I'm sorry to be the bearer of this message, but this is what the evidence calls for. Sustained U.S. measures are needed to counter Chinese challenges seen in every major area of Chinese foreign policy behavior, as indicated by the examples I will discuss briefly. I have about 9 different examples. The challenges come on top of the well-recognized challenge to U.S. interest and influence posed by China's unremitting advances in military capacity and power. This gets a lot of attention, targeting the United States in Asia in particular. So I'm not going to treat that issue. I think that's well known. I'm going to try to treat ones that aren't so well known. They're known well enough by China specialists for sure, but I'm going to deal with other dimensions which are challenges to the United States and the West. And keep in mind, it's not that the Chinese target the United States directly in this instance. No, China is interested in growing in wealth and power, and it wants to do it its way. I don't necessarily see a Chinese strategy to undermine the world order or this type of thing, no. But the world order is in the way of China doing what it wants to do, and it wants to do it China's way. And the upshot of this is it does undermine the world order, it does undermine the interests of their neighbors, and so on. So this is the point I'm trying to make. So I don't necessarily say the Chinese have this game plan, let's get rid of the United States. It's rather they're taking all these actions in a whole different set of areas that undermine America and its interests and its power. Okay, let's take a look first at the salient one, Russia. China's Russian and entente. China's partnership with Russia has significantly strengthened, and President Putin and President Xi support forward momentum. Powers pose increasingly serious challenges to the U.S.-supported order in the respective priority spheres of influence: Russia in Europe and the Middle East, and China in Asia. China backs Russia in carrying out military exercises to intimidate countries in Europe and the Middle East, and in efforts to divide NATO and the European Union. Russia backs China in carrying out exercises supporting Beijing's expansionism in the South China Sea, Chinese pressure tactics to weaken U.S. alliances with South Korea and Japan, and efforts to undercut U.S.-led sanctions against North Korea. So that's just in a nutshell, but this is a big area of cooperation which works directly against U.S. interests. Probably however, second, but not second in priority, I think this is the most important difference apart from the military dimension, and I think it might even be more important than the military dimension. This is China's exploitative economic practices. China's 3-decade-long efforts using state-directed development policies to plunder foreign intellectual property rights and undermine international competitors have had a profound negative impact on the U.S. and Western interests. Beijing does so with hidden and overt state-directed economic coercion, egregious government subsidies, import protection and export promotion using highly protected and state-supported products to weaken and often destroy foreign competition in key industries, and build military power to secure China's primacy in Asia and the world leadership. They allow companies like Huawei to attempt to dominate international communication enterprises. The profits also support massive state-directed Chinese efforts to lead high-technology industries that will define the economic and military leadership in world affairs. Beijing disguises these practices with its predatory with avowed support for globalization. China increasingly gains international legitimacy for its predatory economic practices from the UN Secretary General and other world leaders. And so here the Chinese use the West, they manipulate it, and Western businesses cooperate with China in many areas. It's in the interest of these companies to do so. And so for these kinds of reasons, we find that the Chinese are very successful in doing this sort of thing. And it's a very serious challenge for the United States going forward and for Western countries as a whole, for all of those that have a stake in the free market system. The second point on the economic side I want to mention is that they build and exploit economic dependence. And here what you find is that China really disregards globalization and WTO rules and things like that when they want to defer. They use this economic leverage to get a country to defer the demands. Australia has been in the news lately. It's been subjected to these kinds of pressures. I don't need to go into this in much detail. The Chinese can organize these things informally, so they're not technically at odds with WTO arrangements through party channels. They're able to do this. And the result is boycotts that cost these countries billions of dollars. South Korea, $20 billion was lost in a dispute with China over the past couple of years. And Australia is facing that situation today. This is not consistent with the free market system or the WTO rules, but the Chinese do it and they get away with it. And increasingly, they're getting support for their system. And this is where the international legitimation of China's model is something that's, I think, very worrisome. As a creditor, China undermines World Bank, IMF, OECD guidelines as it goes forward with these arrangements under the Belt and Road and other initiatives. And these lead to debt traps, and they lead to projects that are corrupt and not in the best interests of these countries. I'll talk a little bit about this later, but they manage to use this as leverage. And once countries become debt dependent on China, then they can make demands on them for other things and get them. And these could involve access to facilities. They could involve how they deal with various policy issues and so forth. And then we have the fostering corrupt and or authoritarian governments against the West. And here too, you have a symbiosis. The Belt and Road Initiative is done in a non-transparent way. Authoritarian governments tend to like this, and particularly if they're on the outs with the IMF and the World Bank. And so they make deals with China under these auspices. And the Chinese are cooperative in dealing with this. And if these officials are corrupt, they get benefits. Their country loses, but they get benefits for their corrupt practices. So what you find is a symbiosis, that the Chinese interests are well served, as are corrupt leaders and authoritarian leaders. And these folks are often against the West in a whole range of ways. And so this is a big problem for the United States and Western allies. So many of these countries are close to the Chinese because of these kinds of interests. In addition, the Chinese provide surveillance systems and communication systems. They also work with these countries' news outlets to foster views positive of the country, but also positive of China. And these kinds of stakes that these countries have in the Belt and Road Initiative are in infrastructure, railroads, dams, electric grids, this kind of thing. And this kind of thing, once it's established, and communication systems and surveillance systems, once these are established, they're very difficult to change. For maintenance, you have to go back to China. If you end your affiliation with China, then you have to start again, and it's very difficult to transfer. So this is a key source of influence that the Chinese use. And keep in mind, in my judgment, the Chinese are more cognizant and more likely to use economic influence of various sorts than any other power I've ever seen. It's amazing. They use it. They're always looking for influence in this regard. And there are so many examples of this that one can look at. These corrupt authoritarian leaders or authoritarian leaders who work closely with China, Central Asia and the Middle East, many of these countries. But the more documented cases are in Venezuela and Ecuador, Serbia, Montenegro, in Europe, Djibouti and Zambia in Africa, the Maldives and Sri Lanka in South Asia, Cambodia, Laos, Malaysia, Myanmar, and the Philippines in Southeast Asia. And then we have the issue of coercing neighbors leveraging unconventional assets. And here they coerce their neighbors. This is hegemonism. The Chinese would call this hegemonism if the U.S. practiced it, and that's what it is. And they repeatedly do this in the South China Sea. You see this all the time, and it's in the news a lot. And you see it in the East China Sea and in Taiwan. They tend not to use the Navy directly. They use the maritime militia and they use the Coast Guard. And these are massive forces that the Chinese have to use in this regard. And so in this way, they intimidate these neighbors and get them to do what China wants them to do. And in addition, they also use their influence in other ways. And around the region, China has influence because it controls the headwaters of the Mekong River. All of those countries are very dependent on China because of that, and they use it effectively to make sure these countries do what China wants them to do. And in the case of Myanmar, the Chinese have a lot of influence with the dissidents, the armed dissidents in the country, and they use that. And so you could say, well, China doesn't interfere in other countries' internal affairs. You've got to be kidding. So this is an important element. I shouldn't be polemical. I'll try to be a little bit more measured in my approach. I get a little excited about this sort of thing in the sense of just trying to make the point. And then you get into these influence operations that the Chinese carry out. They mobilize the Chinese diaspora to influence the internal affairs of various countries so that they will do things that the Chinese want them to do. They win over foreign dignitaries to work in support of Chinese objectives, and they influence the media and journalism in many states. And so they also try to penetrate high technology centers for desired information that China wants. They use their 1,000 talents programs and IPR theft in various ways. And then the disregard for international law. So it's not just WTO norms and things like that. It's the law. And of course, the South China Sea decision of 2016 is a very good example, but there are many others. These illegal abductions, prolonged detentions of foreign citizens in China is a remarkable situation. And of course, they hold hostages. If countries don't do what they want, they arrest some people and hold them until the issue with the foreign country is resolved. And then one final point of these measures is the way they deal with Europe and the way they deal with ASEAN. In the past, in that period when I wrote the first to second edition of this book, China was seen as using Europe as sort of a pole in the multipolar world. They wanted a strong Europe. That's changed. China is now dividing Europe. It's in their way. The EU is in their way. They want to expand their influence in the region. The EU guidelines work against that, and so they undermine it. And ASEAN, they used to be very scrupulous in how they abided by ASEAN rules and ASEAN norms. Now they've committed the cardinal sin of ASEAN. They've divided it. They've tried to maneuver one against the other, and they've done this successfully since 2012. So at the end of the day, I say this is a very sort of serious situation. All of these challenges have a big impact on the United States and the Western countries as a whole, and allies and partners too. And so I think they need strong countermeasures in my humble judgment here. And so the outlook, will the U.S. sustain the countermeasures to deal with these challenges? That's a very big question. Will it do it? And I think it's not clear at this point. On the one hand, you have a bipartisan congressional resolve to do so, and that's backed by the media, and public opinion is now very distrustful of Chinese leaders. And so this suggests that, yes, this would get a lot of support inside the United States. But on the other hand, we have a new government coming in, a government that has many critics of the current policies that they've been excessive and so forth, and there's validity to those charges to a considerable degree. But more important, this government is preoccupied with domestic factors, and the overall cost of acute competition with China could be very great, and distract from funding for other things that could be more advantage for the United States. In addition, they have a more nuanced policy. It's a big tent. They have all sorts of people in their camp. They can move in different directions depending on who you talk to, at least. But it is more nuanced for sure against in dealing with China. And so looking out in the short term, it's important to keep in mind that the toughness on the part of Mr. Biden and the Democratic Party in dealing with China is a feature of this year. If you go back and look at the record in 2019 of all the Democratic candidates, they didn't see China as an urgent danger. They didn't see that. That was common in Washington, but that wasn't seen in the campaign. You look at Mr. Biden's record in 2019, he dismissed it to a considerable degree. He changed, and maybe his people have changed in a serious way. But the bottom line is that the change is recent. And so how far will they go in this sort of thing? Will they, and I think that now you look at the situation and you find that it's really, the situation is such that the preoccupations are elsewhere. China isn't a burning issue, and probably it shouldn't be. I think that's appropriate. So they'll be slow to address these issues, it seems to me. And they're preoccupied with many other questions. So will we have, and one of the answers that the candidates for the Democratic Party and Mr. Biden have emphasized, that they're going to work with allies and partners, and allies in particular. It's great. They kept saying that. But the point is, they didn't say how it's going to work. And that's what's needed, is an approach, a strategy, really, of how are you going to do this? Because these allies are not in the same position as the United States. the United States is more ahead in recognizing these challenges posed by China. Some of the allies are similar, but not too many. And the counterforces in those governments, like the counterforce in the United States, to this kind of approach to China, is rest a lot on business. Businesses has this strong interrelationship with China. It's not that business is bad; they're doing their right thing. That's good. That's in the broad interest of the United States. But the Chinese are using this kind of leverage for their own purposes. And these purposes are not in the interest of the United States. So this is a real problem in dealing with allies. Allies probably won't want to sacrifice a lot of their business interests in China. And so how do you get them to do that for the sake of dealing with these, for the sake of countermeasures against these Chinese challenges? So I'm sorry I don't have a good answer for all of this. It's not clear where we're going. But I appreciate your listening, and that's the summary of that's my take in the book, and it just lays out what they're doing here, what they're doing here, what they're doing here, what they're doing here, and what you see is a common element in all of those things. It does undermine the interests of the United States and the power of the United States, and the influence of the United States. And countermeasures are warranted, in my judgment. Okay, so I'll stop there, and I look forward to the questions and answers.
Thank you so much, Bob, for a really engaging and thought-provoking discussion of your new work. And we've got lots of questions that are coming in. So rather than abusing my position as chair, why don't we go ahead and jump right in and begin actually with one of our own students here at the Elliott School, a junior, Zhongmin Li, who asked about China's position as the world's factory for technology. Zhang goes on and says, many countries, including the US and its allies, have been using Chinese technology products for their defense sectors, as well as security sectors, such as the recent crackdown, on the Uyghurs and such. Zhang would like to know if it would be possible for the U.S. and its allies to counter China's technology and influence capabilities in the face of this monopoly, and if so, how? And if I could add a question, are we at the point where China is less kind of as it were, copying American technology, and more at the point where China is doing a brain drain from the United States in the sense of much of their technology industry actually is led by people who came to the United States and work for tech giants and have now returned to China and are deploying some of their business know-how and skills there. Mm-hmm. So I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks. Good questions, both of you. And this is very difficult. And this is a very serious problem, and it needs a careful government leadership. And I'm not sure how much support they're going to get from the business community. Many people on Capitol Hill have been working on this issue for some time, and others have as well. Because this is why. You're dealing with a system where the party state has all the resources of the state to pursue this objective. They can mobilize them all through the party structure. Whereas the United States is very pluralistic. It's very hard to do this sort of thing, to counter it. So I think, how do you do that? How do you counter it? Well, I think, I'm not sure how close you want to get to it. Because if you get really close and dependent, then they're going to use the dependency leverage on you. And so I think we need a stronger effort inside the United States, working with like-minded allies and partners, and I think that's underway already. I think those things are happening to develop and advance our high-tech systems. And as far as the brain drain is concerned, this drain has been going on for a long time. This is not new. And the IPR stuff has been going on for 30 years. And we were at a stage in 2016 where the Chinese had now reached advanced capacity so that they didn't really have to use IPR theft anymore. They just had to purchase the companies. And they were going around purchasing these startup companies with all these people. And this was beneficial to these people. It was beneficial to the company. This is where the problem comes. They wanted to be bought up by the Chinese because they make a lot of money, have access to the Chinese market, and so forth. So the Chinese willingness to use this, the ability to use this vehicle, they have a lot of money. They'll just go and purchase it. Restrictions have been now imposed, so that can't happen. And increasingly, they're being imposed in other developed countries. But it just shows the challenge that you face in dealing with the systemic kind of administration that follows that has these objectives. And when they have an objective, they can pursue it with such might, whereas the West, and the United States in particular, has difficulty doing that because we don't control our business. The government doesn't control the business community. And so you have to persuade and so forth, and that it's much more difficult in the U.S. I think we can do it, but it underlines the challenge.
Great. We have a veritable explosion of questions going on in the Q&A. We'll try and get through as many as we can. One from Terry Louts, the former vice president of the Luce Foundation, asked, why did we as foreign observers get China so wrong in the past? Was it wishful thinking or lack of evidence-based research? Or perhaps a change in China, such as Xi Jinping's consolidation of power and other factors?
Well, thanks, Terry. It's great to get your question. I'm thinking about this myself. I think it depends on the period that you're in looking at the development of U.S.-China relations. Clearly, in the 70s, the U.S. needed a strategic ally to work with them against the Soviet Union. The Americans felt themselves in a passive position, and of course, the Chinese were in a passive position in the face of the Soviet Union, very powerful force at that time. And so there, the desire for this ally or this partner to contend with the Soviet power was overwhelming, it seems to me. Then later, we had this move toward engagement and the idea of changing China. And I think there was a great deal of confidence in the United States once the Cold War was over that we won, that our system won. And we were riding high in 1990, 91, 92. And so and very cavalier in thinking about opponents. And of course, China was badly treated after Tiananmen, as you remember. And so at that point, then the engagement policy seemed logical. Then China became more powerful. Pretty quickly, in 1995, 96, Taiwan Straits crisis, and Clinton had to change his policy, pay more attention to China. And that's when the engagement policy was really fostered. And there, the rationale was we need to encourage China to join the world, and this is going to be in our benefit. And I think there was a sincere belief in that, but I'm not sure it was fact-based. I think it might have been based for other reasons. Bill Clinton didn't want trouble with China after the Taiwan Straits crisis. And so he needed to change his policy. He did. He was under tremendous pressure from Congress for doing it, and yet he did it. And yet, what did he want? Well, did he really want this engagement, or was engagement a rationale? It's hard to know. I'm not sure. And so I don't know whether that's a correct reading or not. But the point I'm getting at here is that it varied over time, the different rationales. And the recent engagement policy, I think it was fostered in the 1990s as part of an effort to ease tensions with China and to incorporate and thereby go forward without having big trouble with China. Clinton had big trouble with China in 95, 96, and he didn't want to repeat that.
Well, Bob, we're getting a lot of questions, as you might expect, about Taiwan and Sino-Taiwanese relations. I see one in particular from Paul Seeger. Paul, thanks so much for joining us today. A 1997 Elliott School grad and, of course, Gaston's son. If I can kind of put all these together and summarize, especially given what's been happening in Hong Kong as well as the stated American commitment to protecting Taiwanese democracy. Paul asked, is it inevitable at this point that Taiwan will be absorbed by the mainland? And kind of more broadly, how do you see Taiwan playing into the future of Sino-American relations?
Thanks, Paul, for the really interesting question. I don't think Taiwan will be absorbed into the PRC anytime soon. You got to look, I look at the record. I've been dealing with this issue ever since I became an analyst at the CIA back in the late 60s. The Taiwan issue has been an issue throughout that period. And I think what's happened here is that it's gone on for 70 years. Taiwan is a separate entity. And so even through thick or thin, it's had ups and downs for sure. But the point is that it's still there and it's doing pretty well. And so I don't think it's going to be absorbed anytime soon. You have to look at the realities, power realities. I think the power realities still support the argument that the PRC is not going to attack Taiwan soon. Now, if you maybe Ben can refresh. What's the second part of the question, Ben? I absorbed in the PRC and Taiwan.
Just a kind of a broader. What do you think is the role of Taiwan in Sino-American relations moving forward?
Oh yeah. Well, obviously, it's very important these days, and it's this has changed. I have a complicated system that I use to analyze this, but basically, this administration has really broadened the one China policy in a way that we've never seen before since normalization of relations. And it's done so because the pressures of the PRC on Taiwan warrant it. The PRC pressures have been trying to change the status quo. And so the idea is that, well, the U.S. should do things to change it back because we want to sustain the status quo. That's in our interest to do that. And so the main problems in doing that in the past were various breaks. And the main break was, of course, PRC power, and that's still a break. But other breaks really are less important. It used to be that the U.S. government would worry a lot about the stability of the relationship with China. Well, obviously, Donald Trump's government didn't worry about that. They disrupted that all the time. And then the U.S. would worry about allies and partners being worried about U.S. disruption of relations with China. And that was overtaken by events as well. And the U.S. would worry that the government of Taiwan would somehow use this to be provocative against Beijing. And under Tsai Ing-wen, that's not the case. And so I think you have the incentives to go ahead are strong, and the brakes are not very are weaker. Mr. Biden will be somewhat different, I think. I don't know exactly how, of course, but in the past, he was affiliated with the Obama government, which was very strict in how it applied the one China policy. That's the opposite of what you're seeing in the Trump administration. So if that were to happen, you would see a constriction of these initiatives that have taken place under the Trump administration. I don't think you'll see it overtly. I think it would be something of atrophy to some degree, just less attention. Now, I think what I'm seeing coming from the Obama spokespeople is that they're anxious to move forward with Taiwan in many areas. I think these are areas that are not so sensitive to Beijing. On areas sensitive to Beijing, I wonder how far they will go. I definitely think they won't go as far as the Trump government has done, but that's unprecedented what the Trump government has done. So I guess there'll be some atrophy in the initiatives that have taken place vis-a-vis Taiwan.
Well, keeping your crystal ball in front of you to prognosticate into the future, we have another question from Giulio Puglisi, who was a visiting scholar in our suite at the Seeger Center. And Professor Puglisi asked, what are the highlights of the 2021 National Defense Authorization Act on U.S.-China policy? And what are the major policy challenges you foresee? Obviously, you just addressed with Taiwan, but perhaps more broadly.
Well, the act is. I don't think we have a text of the act yet. It's reportedly a couple of thousand pages in length, We have the conference report, which is 4,000 pages in length, and we have a summary put out by the Senate Armed Services Committee, which is only 15 pages, which is, so I've looked at the 15 pages, and I've read that thoroughly, the summary, and they have a China section in it. And there, the initiatives are focused heavily on Indo-Pacific strategy. The Washington Post had an article this morning, which I think captured the China language in the bill pretty well. And so it's consistent with a concern in the Congress, a broad concern with China as a danger, as an opponent, and it shows through in this Indo-Pacific strategy where they're trying to get the Defense Department to move in directions that will prepare them better to deal with the danger. All very understandable. This bill is not as strong as the bill that took place 2 years earlier. That National Defense Authorization Act had all sorts of provisions that were reflecting a sense of urgency on dealing with China. This bill has urgency, but it's not nearly as much. But it's more than last year. The last year's bill was even less urgent, and more scattered treatment. So this still advocates the whole of government approach. It's still, and it wants a firm policy. It would be, I think, consistent with my basic point I made today, that China is challenging us and across the board, and we need to have a whole of government effort against them. So that's the way I see it. As far as Taiwan is concerned, I haven't seen the Taiwan provisions. I know there are some. I don't think they change things too much. They keep the momentum of majorities in Congress showing their support for a vigorous U.S. effort to counter Chinese challenges.
Following on the Defense Authorization Act, we have from Jonathan Evanson over at the Department of Defense asking in his personal capacity. It seems that the question is less about are countermeasures necessary, but rather what measures would be effective at this point without tipping competition into conflict. So just to summarize the question, what do you think would be effective countermeasures?
I think I understand. I'm not sure. I think Taiwan is the area where you run the risk of real confrontation with Beijing, conflict. I'm not sure Beijing is going to go to war over punitive tariffs. Mr. Trump sort of undercut the Thucydides trap, didn't he? He really didn't do the Thucydides trap. He linked. And so if you're opposing China in various ways, you can link it to other issues. And so this kind of approach is, so I think I think what's more effective, of course, I think is an across-the-board type of strategy, like Mr. Biden says he wants to do. He wants to have this, working with allies and partners, come up with a unified front and thereby be strong in dealing with China across the board in areas where their behavior is bad from the point of view of these countries. But that takes time. I'm not sure how quickly, and as I indicated, I'm not sure how anxious these allies are going to be to have a tougher policy toward China. The record shows that China, when that happens, that China is very likely to take it out on them rather than take it out on the United States. And so for power concerns. And so the result here is that I guess I'm not too worried about confrontation except in the Taiwan case. You could say, well, South China Sea, I think the Defense Department and the Chinese military seem to be interacting a lot and making sure that these things don't lead to conflict, these face-offs that take place from time to time. So, but I do think Taiwan is something that China feels very strongly about, and the U.S. is taking unprecedented steps toward it. They're all sort of incremental. I think they're still consistent with the one China policy. But they are getting more and more attention from Beijing.
Great. We've got lots of questions about both American and Chinese multilateralism. So if I can kind of summarize those, these are from Jake Lettery, Dave Keegan over at SAIS, and Professor Siberek in Poland. On the first part of the question, how do you see the United States creating and sustaining a multilateral and multi-allied response to China's growth, as it were, at present? I mean, you just referred to the fact that China will often pick on the little guy, as it were, as the weak link in the chain. So how can the United States, really kind of resurrect those alliances to try and, as it were, contain, for lack of a better term, China? And Professor Siberek from Poland asks about the idea of multilateralism with Chinese characteristics, noting that China is engaging various countries in multilateral formats and forms in Africa and Latin America.
Mm-hmm. Well, on the second point, multilateralism with Chinese characteristics, this is something that yes, this is a spreading influence. This is part of how they do it, and so they have their respective organizations, and they build attention and goodwill. And right now, the Chinese image in non-Western countries or non-Western oriented countries is quite good. They're doing pretty well in many of these places. Will that sustain itself? I'm not so sure. The Belt and Road could fade. All sorts of things can happen that could change that. But for now, yes, it's effective. I think if there's a united front on the part of the Western powers and Japan and Australia and India and others to work together to counter this, then I think that might be a different outcome. But the strategy itself of how you do this is unclear, and I don't have an easy answer for that. I saw evidence of doing that in the Trump administration on various issues that were important to them. And so here you found that several things happened, but one of them had to do with basically working together to make sure China didn't acquire the high technology of these countries that through illicit means. Or even through purchase at this point, to protect those high technology companies. And that worked pretty well. There was a common effort to do that. And then you had the effort to work against Chinese economic practices, the protectionism, mercantilism. The Chinese practice mercantilism, and pressure the Chinese on that score. And there was some of that. And then there's this whole sense that how far should we limit our businesses in dealing with China? And here it's so you get, and the Huawei is the case that comes up here. How do you deal with Huawei? And you found that at first the allies didn't want to do this, but then the security people, the intelligence officers of these places, started working in their governments and started coming out and their legislatures in Europe. And before you know it, that argument, the argument basically boils down to this. On the security side, if you don't give the security side enough attention, and if you just emphasize the economic productivity side and how much money you're going to make and this sort of thing, then you risk being dominated by China. I want to put it I'm sorry not to put it in more mild terms, but that's the thing. And if you don't do something about that, if you don't give security a higher priority than economic benefit for companies, then that's what you risk. And so that generally works. That argument generally works. It takes time, and it's just sinking into Europe in many cases. But Australia gets it for sure, and Canada gets it now too. So it's but that's what you risk. And that's at the end of the day. So you want to do something about that, and you can build a strategy around that. It seems to me, and I think, but how you do it exactly is you have to. The main obstacle I see is business. It's the business community, and I don't want to. They have their interest, so I don't want to be seen as anti-business here. But the security apparatus has to work to deal with business and how it has a stake in China and how you deal with that stake.
So, Bob, we're getting a lot of questions about both the continuities and potential discontinuities with the American administrations as we're looking at a changeover. And on the one hand, your book and your talk, you talk about how this is fundamentally different. We have a whole of government approach where the Sino-American relationship is just fundamentally viewed through different eyes. On the other hand, you've already talked a little bit about your expectations for the Biden administration, perhaps to turn down the temperature a little bit, to moderate in some of its actions about how it approaches China. And I'm just wondering if you could perhaps put that a little bit more concretely, and I'll give you an example that's come up in the questions. You know, we in the university and educational sector have seen the Department of State suspend the Fulbright with China, not just because of the pandemic. We've also seen the increasing skepticism towards the Confucius Institutes, which has also gone in and out of the various versions of the defense authorization. And so I wonder, as we move to a new administration, which you've already talked a little bit about in terms of Biden's willingness to at least use public rhetoric against China, what do you see as some of the continuities that will mark American policy and some of the discontinuities that may mark American policy?
Well, that's really hard to know. I mean, when I talk with my students, I say when you write a paper, you can write about the future, but then it's all speculation, and so I can never tell if it's right or wrong. And so I don't know how to give you a grade. Whereas if you write it on the basis of what's been happening, then it's better. And so what's been happening is, of course, the whole of government approach, as you mentioned, and this is what this is my framework of looking at this. To reverse significantly any of these things on the part of the administration, I think runs the risk of serious blowback from Congress. And I think the media will pay very close attention to this. The Washington Post article on the China in the National Defense Authorization Act is a good example of that. Here you have, 2,000 or 3,000 page bill, and that's the story they run on the bill. And so I think that's emblematic of the kind of attention you'll get. So the point is, if you do it, you risk running controversy. You're creating controversy on Capitol Hill. And if you want funding for the economic revival of the United States and dealing with the pandemic and so forth in the Biden government, do you really want that kind of a problem on Capitol Hill for the sake of China, for the sake of easing tensions with China? And so I think it's going to be very hard for them to justify easing tensions with China, putting aside the pressures that have been imposed in the near future, because their priorities are elsewhere, and they need the Congress to some degree, and so they won't want to have a big fight with the Republicans, at least in the Congress at this time. And keep in mind, a lot of Democrats favored this approach too. They'll probably be loyal to the party and probably won't make a big fuss, but they won't necessarily be very supportive either. So these kinds of, now on Fulbright and things like that, I can see the rationale for resuming Fulbright. I don't think that's a favor to China in that sense. But I'm not sure how it depends on how it's done. But if you're making something that seemed like a concession, then you have to have some tangible Chinese give. And I don't see Xi Jinping or China. Everything I've read that they say indicates they have done nothing wrong. They don't have to remedy any behavior in order to going forward. And so I don't, unless you get that kind of compromise, I think it'd be hard to justify a serious change in your current policy.
So changing our tone a little bit, Donald Barnes, who's retired from the EPA, because we've been talking about the conflict and tension between the United States, he poses the question, what areas of fruitful cooperation exist with China? Where are the areas that we can make a deal that goes back to the win-win formula that was such the talk of previous decade?
Well, I obviously environmental issues are something that the climate change is very important for the president-elect, and so I think that they will want to do that. I think we should go in. I doubt that the Chinese will do things much differently than they would ordinarily do if they have or don't have the discussions with the United States. But I think it's important for U.S. leadership to do that, to be a leader and with China, if necessary, in this area. So I can see that being an area of progress. I can see working on the pandemic together in some way can maybe an area of progress without being seen as accommodating China in some way. And so I do think these are areas of cooperation. I guess I'll say, what we've learned is that this cooperation often comes with things you hadn't expected. And that's where we're getting into cyber theft and the talents program and all of this sort of stuff where we're interacting with China and they take advantage of it and they subvert it. They subvert your interest. And people, friends of mine who run public policy institutes that are designed to encourage good relations, they don't like Chinese United Front tactics. And yet the United Front Party tactics are something that they have to live with. I'm not sure they even know it's happening. And yet they're being used in various ways. And so this kind of sensitivity has to be strong. And this is where the Chinese system, where they can mobilize these kinds of things much more readily than we can in the United States, makes it hard to have this embrace when you don't know exactly what else is going to be at stake here, and what's hidden efforts are underway, and so this is a real problem.
We've got a couple of questions regarding an assessment of the Trump administration's policy towards China. On the one hand, from Stuart Goldman, a scholar in residence at the National Council for Eurasian and East European Research. He asks, what is your net assessment of the Trump administration's 4 years on policies towards China? And as a corollary to that, from the Voice of America Mandarin service, we have a question regarding what do you think the precedent set by Trump's confrontational China policies will be, and do you see them continuing with the Biden administration?
Yeah, the bottom line here on Trump, Mr. Trump and his administration. I worked for Hillary Clinton in the 2016 campaign. I've never voted for a Republican in my life. And but Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton would not have made the changes in China policy that Donald Trump has made. And these changes were absolutely very important to alert the country to what the challenges are and to take it seriously. And so obviously it's been very erratic. The president is not an attractive person as far as I am concerned, and so but he did that, and if he hadn't done that, we'd have been blithely moving along in a way that would not have reacted in a way that we need to react, and so that's important. And I think his strategy, the defense strategy, the Indo-Pacific strategy, and the national security strategy of the Trump government are good strategies. That's what we should be doing. If he didn't do them, that was the problem. I mean, he's very erratic, and he would undermine them in various ways. But if you do those strategies, I think you'll be okay in dealing with the Chinese challenges. So that's my view of the Trump situation.
We've got a specific question here from a GW student who asked, Gina Park asks, if you think China is expressing its interest in joining the CPTPP is an attempt to increase its presence in global economics while the U.S. is busy with its presidential elections? Namely, is Chinese multilateralism just a feint, as it were, while the United States is distracted in our own electoral mess?
Well, it's not just a feint. I think it's what Gina is talking about is that the Chinese are advancing their interest and power and influence, and so they're on a roll. The RECEP agreement was important for China, and the Chinese media is just full of this praising of this type of approach, and in China and Asia. Of course, Asia is the one area where China can actually trade and have some growth. The other parts of the world are all in rough shape because of the pandemic. And so they're emphasizing ASEAN and emphasizing this trade relationship, and this is all part of this effort, this momentum, which is being used to highlight Chinese influence and profile, and look favorable, and get people not to pay attention to China's role in the pandemic and to the disputes in the South China Sea and the East China Sea and other kinds of negatives, but to look, or Hong Kong, but to look at the economic side, which the Chinese strength that the Chinese have in their public relations.
Great. Well, I know we've been abusing you a little bit in terms of asking for speculation looking forward to the next administration, but this one actually goes back to your roots of evidence-based, and it is actually about your book. So I think these are good ones to kind of wrap up with. Can you speak a little bit generally about how the field of Chinese studies and analysis has changed between the first edition of your work and the present edition of your work? And then specifically, can you talk perhaps a little bit about the differences between the first edition of your book and this new edition, and how you've also seen your own intellectual trajectory, as it were, change over that period?
Mm-hmm. Thanks for the question. I think the field of China studies has changed in the sense that what's mainstream is no longer the idea that China is working toward accommodation to the world order. That has gone out the window. And people that see that, and some people still talk about that China is moving in this direction, I think they just ignore the data. The data seems to me is convincing in showing that China wants to change the order in ways that remove obstacles to what they want to do, and so that's changed, because I think the prevailing view in various circles had been that China was conforming, willy-nilly, but conforming to the world incrementally over time. So that's a change in, so those folks and there are still people who argue, though they really still are, and that it's the U.S. fault, that the U.S. has been constraining them and containing them and so forth. So that's the focus. In my own instance, I was very ambivalent about this. I didn't know whether China was going to be positive or negative. I have a lot of experience with China. Maoist China was constantly moving in very zigs and zags, and Deng Xiaoping did too. And so I said, well, they could change. They could change with circumstances changing. They will change. And so I was very hesitant to do this, and that's still where I am in dealing with this issue. But what I found is that the circumstances have changed. The behavior of China has changed a lot. Now, when you're an academic, when you're a teacher, and you have a lot of different interests, you're not every day called on to be up to date on things. Keep that in mind when students ask questions. Understand your professor may not know the answer, and so. But the bottom line here is that you don't, so you can't pay attention to everything. But I found in 2017, I was asked to be the director of a big study of the National Bureau of Asian Research on Russia-China relations. And going in, I had a view of Russia-China relations. As a government official, I had written a national intelligence estimate on Russia-China relations. I felt I knew it really well. And I found the evidence of Chinese collaboration with Putin to be remarkable. I said, wow. And it really wasn't hidden. It's just nobody was paying attention. And so I said, this is remarkable. If this is how the Chinese want the major power relationships to go, they're out to get us. They're out to get us. But I finished. It took 2 years. There were over 120 people in this project. We were really busy and lots of projects, lots of publications. That changed my mind. And then I got to look at these other areas. What the hell's going on with them? If this is the way Russia-China's working, and we didn't think that it was, well, then what else is happening? And that's where all this literature has come out. That makes me very sympathetic with these studies. What they're showing is a two-faced approach. And it's, I'm sorry, it's mendacious. And this is, and it's designed to be mendacious. So this is a challenge. This is a real challenge, and that's why I said that MO, mode of operation, looking at that research, how I came to that realization, made me then start paying attention to all these other things, and lo and behold, it's across the board, and that's the conclusion of this book. So that's my transition, because I really was very moderate toward China before I did that Russia-China project. I was very, let's work it out. We can work it out. No problem. That was me. Well, that's not me anymore.
Well, Bob, thank you so much for your time today and for really giving us a teaser of what's in the book, and a very rich book it is. As I mentioned at the beginning of the session, we have a little stocking stuffer discount for the book, which is going to go up in the chat shortly for a 25% discount. Highly recommend the book, as I think we all got an exceedingly gracious taste from Bob today. If you were part of the Bob fan club, which many of us are, he'll be returning actually for another event on Wednesday, the 9th of December, when we have our next Taiwan roundtable, including Bob, as well as Senator Ed Markey's foreign policy advisor, and 2 Taiwan-based scholars to talk about the American election results a month after and what they portend for the United States and Taiwan. Again, that's on Wednesday, December 9th, and you can find more details about that on the Secret Center website, which should also be posted in the chat box on the site. So thank you so much for your time, Bob, and for your insight. We all greatly appreciate it. And thank you to all of you who've joined us today. We look forward to welcoming you to another event soon in the future. All right.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.